So today, theorists describe stigma as a social process, and it's one that emerges at the co-occurrence of labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination within a power context. So this social process results in some marks, characteristic chronic illnesses like substance use disorders being constructed as indicators of a tarnished character, or of certain people being seen as less than or worse than other people. Stigma is manifested within our structures and individuals. So in other words, this social process that's happening all around us is expressed or experienced at the structural and the individual level. So structural stigma is defined as societal level conditions, cultural norms, and institutional policies that constrain the opportunities, resources, and well-being of the stigmatized. So examples that we've heard about today already are the war on drugs, or policies that prevent people with substance use disorders from accessing really important resources like housing, employment, or treatment. At the individual level, so now among individual people, as researchers, we often differentiate between perceivers and targets. So perceivers are people who don't necessarily live with a stigmatized characteristic themselves, and they may perpetuate stigma. So this could be medical doctors, employers, coworkers, friends and family members, community members in general. And perceivers may endorse prejudice, which involves negative emotions and feelings. Research suggests that prejudice towards people with substance use disorders is characterized by feelings of contempt, and it's expressed by feelings related to moral outrage like anger, disgust, hate, and blame. We also have stereotypes, which are group-based beliefs that are often applied to individuals. So research suggests that people with substance use disorders are perceived as dangerous, unpredictable, responsible for their condition, and not capable of decision-making. And then we have discrimination, which is actual treatment of people with substance use disorders. So we had a national representative survey conducted in 2018 that suggested that about 3/4 of US adults would not want a person with a substance use disorder to marry into their family, and would not want to work closely with a person with a substance use disorder. So this social rejection is a really powerful form of discrimination. So targets, on the other hand, are people who live with the stigmatized characteristic themselves. So targets include people who are living with a substance use disorder or in recovery from one. So they may experience internalized stigma by endorsing those negative beliefs and feelings associated with the stigma and applying them to the self. So essentially, this is feeling like I'm a bad person because of my substance use disorder. Enacted or experienced stigma is experiencing discrimination from other people in the past or present due to one's substance use disorder. This might be like receiving poor medical care because of one's substance use disorder. And then anticipated stigma is expecting to experience discrimination in the future because of one's substance use disorder, like expecting that if I go into a hospital that I'm going to be treated worse. These stigma manifestations undermine resources. For example, they prevent people from accessing treatment and jobs. They compound social isolation, and they lead to psychological responses like depression, stress, and avoidant coping. And together, these mediating mechanisms can lead to substance use and undermine treatment outcomes among people with substance use disorders. So turning back to the research, I'd like to summarize some of our findings on stigma and substance use related outcomes at each of these levels of stigma manifestations. So at the structural level, the war on drugs, again, is one of our most commonly cited examples of structural stigma. So these policies are critiqued as treating people with substance use disorders as criminals rather than as people who are living with chronic illnesses. And they lead to increased risks of incarceration, which can impact people's health and their recovery. An additional example is barriers that exist to prescribing or accessing evidence-based treatments. At the level of the individual perceiver, people who aren't necessarily living with a substance use disorder themselves, some work has focused on healthcare workers and shown that nurses in treatment settings who are higher in implicit or unconscious prejudice have greater job turnover and provide worse healthcare to people with substance use disorders. In other areas, perceivers note that they would be less likely to hire someone with a substance use disorder. They agree with refusing housing to people with substance use disorders, and they say that they wouldn't be friends with or want someone with a substance use disorder to marry into their families. Now, this really compounds the social isolation that folks may be experiencing. At the level of the target, the person living with the substance use disorder themselves, we generally see evidence that stigma is associated with greater delayed treatment access and higher rates of dropout. So as examples, people who anticipate more stigma or worry more about how others are going to treat or view them report that they've delayed starting treatment. And people with greater internalized stigma, so I really feel bad about myself because of my substance use disorder, drop out of treatment at higher rates. We also see that people who experience more stigma have more substance use symptoms, so they continue to engage in substance use, perhaps to cope with the stress of experiencing stigma from other people. So unfortunately, there is no one silver bullet to stop the stigma of substance use disorders. I think we heard that earlier today, just like there's no one cure or one silver bullet to end all of addiction or substance use disorders. But what we do have is many tools in the stigma intervention toolkit. So in other words, we have developed a sense of strategies that really work to decrease stigma. We have tools to address stigma at the structural level, such as by changing stigmatizing policies or just making it harder for people to enact discrimination towards other people. We also have tools to address stigma among perceivers, which we'll come back to in a minute. And we have tools to address stigma among targets or people with substance use disorders. Now, some of these tools reduce internalized stigma and others help people be resilient to or protect people from enacted and anticipated stigma or stigma from other people. One of our most powerful ways to address stigma among perceivers, including the general population, healthcare providers, and others, is through contact. Contact is how sharing our personal stories can change stigma. We have a lot of research on this, and this strategy appears to be effective at reducing stigma associated with many characteristics, so substance use, race, HIV, and other things. Contact can happen either in person, like when people interact and talk with each other, or vicariously, like through the media, TV, the radio, podcasts, books. Research suggests that contact leads to increased empathy and perspective taking with people who are living with a stigmatized characteristic. It also leads to enhanced knowledge, which can lead people to question the stereotypes that they may have held. And it reduces people's anxiety about interacting with someone from a stigmatized group. So in turn, this leads to reduced prejudice. And when we have reduced prejudice paired with reduced stereotypes, we can lower the likelihood of discrimination, which is often our goal. I also want to share today one, it feels small, but it's an evidence-based tool that every one of us on this call today can use to stop stigma, and that is we can all change our language. Research shows that language spreads stereotypes. So individuals described as substance abusers are seen as more deserving of blame and of punishment. They're as unlikely to benefit from treatment. But research also shows that language that is scientifically accurate and people first, like saying people with a substance use disorder, which you've heard a lot of this morning, has been shown to promote perceptions that substance use disorders are chronic but treatable health conditions. So changing language isn't always easy. Recommendations around language change quickly and frequently, so all of us are wrong sometimes here, but there are great resources out there to help us keep up to date, like this tool from the Addiction Policy Forum. So we have many more tools, but the trick here is really to figure out how to use these tools or implement them in ways that make them most effective. And we do have some evidence on how to do this. So we know that multi-component interventions that use more than one stigma reduction tool appear to be more effective. We know that multi-level interventions that address stigma at either both the structural and individual levels or among perceivers and targets appear to be more effective. And then longitudinal interventions that use our stigma reduction tools over time appear to be more effective. So the bad news might be that history tells us that deconstructing stigma isn't an easy job. It's not a quick job. This is why we still have racism and sexism. But the good news is that science tells us that we do have many tools at our disposal to do it. And this meeting is also a great reminder of the good news that we have a lot of demolition experts on our side. So a lot of fantastic people who are using the tools in exciting and important ways to stop the stigma.